Hemshech Ayin Beis. Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We're at the top of page 1218. Aleph Resh Yud Ches. Okay. So since we've entered this Volume 3, a lot has been going on. And briefly, after Volume 2 concluded with explaining the verse, V'yadaita Ayin v'shavesel levavecha ki Hashem ki havayu elikim b'shamayim imal v'al ha'aretz mitochas, that most of that verse, except the last two words, and explaining the unity between the divine within existence, revealing the divine within existence, together with the divine beyond existence. Then came Volume 3, that now will explain Ein Eid. Ein Eid is that Elokim itself, not the revelation that it leads to, but Elokim, the very power of concealment, revealing the power of the divine within that. That night itself, that the night itself will shine like day. Not that the night leads to day. This was the central theme right from the beginning of this volume, which of course is a far deeper level of unity. And that's going to be the theme that we're going now for the next few hundred pages even. So he explained that at length. I'm not going to go through it, of course, right now, but just giving a little context of where we are right now. So with that, we discussed how the moon and Malchus will rise even higher than Zoh. So the moon will be even greater than the sun, not just equal to the sun as it was in the beginning of creation, but greater, be the mashpia. So what is makabel today, the recipient today, the lowest sphere today, will rise to be the highest, all the way to Keser, and be the mashpia, as explained on pages, I'm looking at pages 1208, 1209, that the very Helam of Malchus will be transformed. Okay. To explain that, he went into Havaya Yechatu Merivov, how God annihilates, that the enemies of God will be annihilated, and spoke about that idea of Havaya. Is the Havaya in battle with these enemies, or is God, is Havaya higher than the enemies? Havaya de le'ela. But left with a question that seemingly there's something greater than annihilating the enemies, and that is, or crushing the enemies, the right word, crushing, but rather the transformation of them. That's on top of page 12, that was page 1210 and 1211. Okay, then to understand that, he said, let's understand the difference between Gan Eden and Elam Haba. Gan Eden, the spiritual world of Gan Eden for neshamas, Elam Haba also for souls and bodies. So he went into a discussion of the difference between reward in this world, reward in the world to come, only for neshamas, also for souls and bodies. These were pages 1211, 1212, and at 1213, and there too left a bunch of questions unanswered about when the ultimate reward will be. Will it be, do we have a reward in this world or only in the future? And page 1213, he said, now we have to understand Gan Eden itself. The Gan Eden is essentially the Gilui of Atzilus in Bria, unfiltered. And how's that possible? When we know that from Atzilus to Bria, you need to have the filter or the partition of the Parsa. And that led us into the discussion of Ani Rishon v'Ani Achrin, which we're in the middle of right now. Ani Rishon v'Ani Achrin, which is Ani Rishon goes on Keser, the first of the oldest of all the emanations. Ani Achrin is Malchus. And explanation of Keser and Malchus, how that works, the whole process of creation from Keser to Malchus. That though Malchus is the actual Chisavos, the creation comes through Malchus, but it carries the power of Chachma and all the spheres, which shape the superconscious state of Keser, which is the Ratzon. We spoke Atik and Arich, the Hisnasus Atzmi of the divine that's beyond the ultimate transcendence of the divine, exalted state, that first it becomes a revealed state, then it turns into a ratzon, a desire to relate to another, which is a ratzon lemelucha, and another means something separate from it, because melucha, kingship, is only possible on a stranger, not on something that is part of who you are. And that leads to Malchus, which is where the creation actually happens. So that in turn, leads to Chochmah, Reishis, which is like a Nakuda. Bina shapes it, the Midas shape it even further until it comes to Malchus, and Malchus then becomes the creative force that carries all that all the way into Bria. Malchus becomes the Kesser of Bria, and therefore, and because Malchus is in a form of concealment, because it doesn't reveal what the king is made of. It's not like the faculties of the king that are revealing forces and are also, in a sense, have a relationship. When you have love, you have a relationship of something in common with the thing you love. Malchus is only possible in something that's not similar to you. You don't love you can't be a king over children, over your own body, or so on. So Malchus is conducive to be the place where the concealment takes place. So on one hand, he's melech on the nation, but he remains removed from them. And that, Lamaila, that's creation, the creation process. Lamata, below in the mashal, a king does not create his nation. But above, the king, meaning God as king, creates, because the power of creation has both elements. On one hand, it's removed from the thing it creates, yeshma ayin, there's a distance, and a parsa in between, and then at the same time, it's a king over these nations. So there's an element of also a relationship, but it's a relationship of a melech to an am, not a av to a ben, a father to a child. That was all what I just reviewed now is essentially the pages 1214 rather, till 1217. And the context of Ani Rishon v'Ani Achrin would be like this, that the Rishon of Kesser is wedged in Malchus, because the early stages of Kesser are ultimately realized and fulfilled in Malchus, and Malchus is wedged in Kesser. The beginning and the end. This is what he said on page 1214. And Yerusha v'Ani Achrin. Okay. It's interesting, and I think I pointed it out. I just want to say it again. On page 1210, he also brings Ani Rishon v'Ani Achrin, and there he called Ani Rishon as the air before the Tzimtzum, Ani Achrin is after the Tzimtzum, and then Bil Odai Ein Elikim is that level of Ein Oid, the third level of the unity that he's been discussing. So I'm assuming that ultimately it's going to be connected to what we're learning right now, Kesser and Malchus, and then ultimately Ein Oid, where Malchus becomes the highest level, but he hasn't gotten there yet. Just pointing that out. Okay, now that's up to where we reached to page 1217. 1217. Okay, the Helm. And then at 16 and 17, he also added that this same idea is a microcosm in the 10 spheres of Malchus itself. Kesser Malchus, to all the way to Malchus of Malchus, and all the spheres in between. And ultimately, Malchus of Malchus is the place where all this takes place, the creation process, but it's through a concealment. Now, this concealment, as we learn, and we will learn, is ultimately going to be transformed. But right now, we're still in discussion of where it's a concealment, from Kesser to Biyah. Then he added, the last thing we learned at the bottom of 1217, going into 1218, that Ani Rishon is Kesser Malchus, that's called Rishon, which is removed. Chochmah is called Reishis, because it derives from the Helm of Ayin of Kesser. So Ani Rishon is the letters, Ani is the letters Ayin of Kesser, and that leads, and that reveals that Ayin is revealed in Chochmah, Reishis. And the same thing is Chochmah Shebe Malchus, has the same relationship. Keser Sheba Malchus is removed. Chochma Sheba Malchus begins to reveal, and that develops further to the point that it goes to Malchus Sheba Malchus, which does the process of creation. But then, which is Ani Achrin. But then he added that Ani and Ayin are the same letters, reversed. But because it says Ani, he says Ani also alludes to Chochma. So Ani Rishon really means how Chochma and Keser are united together. So it's not just Keser, it's also Keser and Chochma. And the reason for that is because Chochma is still in a state of seamlessness in relation relative to the spheres below it. So it has something strongly in common with Keser. Okay. Ani Achron is Malchus Sheba Malchus, which becomes Keser of Bria. So it's the last of the spheres, but it's still a Malchus. It's still above and removed, it's Nasus and exalted and transcends compared to Bria. So that's ultimately the pasuk Ani Rishon v'Ani Achron. So we're talking about Keser and Chochma. Ani Achron is Malchus, remains removed as a Melech Keser for the lower levels. Then he said the same is true in each world according to its commensurate to that world. You also have in every world you have a Keser, you have all the spheres and Malchus. So you have the Keser of Bria that ultimately goes into Chochma of Bria all the way to Malchus of Bria, and that will become Keser of Yitzira. And the same process repeats itself, obviously in a lower plane, in a more concealed way. So he goes through Bria, Malchus of Bria, Nasa Keser Yitzira, Zeu Ani Achrin. Then Malchus di Yitzira becomes Keser of Asiya. To the point that it becomes the Keser for the last world, Asiya. And on top of page 1218, that's what it means. Okay, so now he's broadening the whole picture by explaining how it relates to each particular world. Now, the significance of this is really that we need to like clarify and make sure to understand the words Malchus and Keser are not natural words for us. You know, we have to force ourselves to understand them. So let me just put them in simple English. Since we're talking all about an interface between a divine that's completely beyond existence, and beyond, we say completely beyond, not even beyond, altogether a different reality. And he wants an existence where he wants a dira b'tachtenim, and we need an interface. So these levels are really reflective of that interface. When you say Isnasus Atzmi, which is the highest level of Keser, you're basically saying God's reality that is superior to all realities. But that too is a state, because God on his own doesn't need that. He doesn't need to know that he's real. He just is. When you speak about Atzmus, he just is what he is. But since he wants a relationship with us, so he manifested himself in a level called an exalted Malchus Dika level, Melech, Esnasus Atzmi. Esnasus Atzmi, that's not yet a Melech ala Am. He's not yet relating actually to another, but he is in a state already that you can start talking about a state of transcendence, a state of exalted state. That in turn will go through stages to Ratzon, and that will slowly develop into a structural designed relationship, which will conclude what we call Malchus. Malchus of Malchus is essentially that exalted transcendent state is now going to have a relationship with an existence like ours, which is so-called separate from him in our consciousness. So these are simply words. Well, they're more than words, they're levels, but they simply really have to be just translated into understanding. Like when we talked about the Ayin of the Yesh Hamiti would be far more Keser. The Ayin of the Yesh Haniver would be Malchus. So the ultimate goal is to relate to us, the existent reality that is existent, the creations that we are, Biyah, starting from Bria. But it originates in far higher levels. So at the end of the day, what he's really coming to explain is the whole structure of how existence works. So we've learned these ideas earlier, but in different language. Now he's speaking far more the language of Keser and Malchus. what could throw us sometimes is because when we speak about a melech, we don't usually think in these terms. We think a melech, okay, he's the king, we're the subjects, fine. But first of all, the king doesn't create us. And here he does. Because we're talking about king as in an exalted state. So the true nature of kingship is really an exalted state that's higher and transcends the subject, which is creation. So you have to somewhat abstract it from a regular king as we usually know, the king of England or the queen of England type of thing. That's an example for someone that's considered to be a higher class or state, but it's not really captures the full essence of what we're discussing here. And Chachma is where that exalted state is starting to come into some form and shape. And Malchus is when it actually begins to rule over the empire. As we said, there's Isnasus Atzmi. You could have a Ratzon L'Meluchi, you could be desired to be king, but doesn't mean you actually are. You know, by Matan Torah, for example, when God became king, that was 26 generations after the beginning of creation. So even though God was king of the world, right, when Adam was created, and he actually crowned God as king on the first Rosh Hashanah, but the formal coronation really happened on Matan Torah, when Kablu Malchus, when the Jewish people accepted God as king. So the point being is that you can have these levels, but they're not yet applied and actualized. Malchus is where it gets actualized. So that's why he's explaining how this is on all levels, because on all levels you need this relationship. You need the transcendent state. You need it to come in, that's atik, keser. You need that to come into a desire, a ratzon. You need that to get shaped to create the world that we're talking about, let's say keser of Bria, that follows, that Malchus of Atzilus is becoming keser of Bria, that will then create Bria. Then the Malchus of Bria will create Yitzira, the same process on a lower level, all the way to Asiyah. And now he's going to work his way back to what about higher than Atzilus? And we're going to actually go all the way back to before the Tzimtzum. So in all the stages, you have the same pattern, a state that is beyond anything that's not even revealed. That's like what he called like Isnasus Atzmi, that is completely not even revealed. Like the Etzem. You have how it gets revealed, that transcendent state. It turns into a desire, into a shape and form, into an actual leadership, where that level is becoming and shaping and creating the next level. So this goes all the way back to the highest levels before the Tzimtzum. Now, if you go back to what we learned on page on page 1214, you'll see how now he's going to tie up all the connections back to 1214, where he first began discussing by Inyan who he speaks about Malchus the Ein Sof, that everything started with Malchus the Ein Sof, which is the Malchus before the Tzimtzum. So what we're going to learn now is really concluding what we learned there. I'll compare it when we learn it inside. Okay. Now, ultimately, the way things seem to be emerging, this Malchus, which is the Levana, is now it's still in the state of Mekabel. It becomes a mashpia to the next world, but it's still the lowest level, ani achrin, that in it carries the creative force and is still in a state of helam and concealment, like the moon is. La'asad lave, what we learned at the beginning of this volume is that the moon, or Malchus, is going to rise, Eishes Chayil Ateres Baila, higher than all the levels. That will ultimately be the Ein Eid. So it's possible that he's laying the groundwork to explain that ultimately. But now we're still discussing it the way it is before Aveda transforms Malchus, before our work. This is the process of the creation process from the top down, not how we then work through Aveda and transform Malchus into something far greater. But it's clear that Malchus is carrying very deep powers that originate all the way in Keser, and that's why Malchus becomes Keser, because they're all connected, because Malchus has that power of creation. But it's through a state of concealment, whereas the Midas in between are all Chochmah, and Midas are far more higher revelation than Malchus is, in a revealed level, but not in an Etzem level, like we learned as well. But he said in Giluyim, where was the expression? In Giluyim, he said, in Giluyim, Yeah, the bottom of page 1214, he said that the midas are more revealed in the level of Giluyim. Love, for example, is a more revealed state of a person's nefesh than Malchus, because Malchus doesn't reveal much about the person. And it's not a relationship with anyone in any equal way. But on the Etzem HaNefesh, he said, Aval be'etzem HaNefesh, midas melucha mushrish be'etzem HaNefesh yeshem mekol hakeches. So that's why it has that power of ruling, and Malchus dekait, which is like it's above everything else. So we will need both, because you want to have a relationship with God in Giluyim, but we also want to have a relationship with God as he stands in an exalted and transcendent state. So basically, transcendence as he is on his own, transcendence as he relates to us, and in between you have all the revelations necessary to have a full relationship. So the truth is we want all. We want not just a relationship as king and subject, but also as father and son, or in general, as a relationship like husband and wife even. So that comes through the Giluyim. But here the focus right now is more on connection to the exalted or the transcendent state. In Keser, it's completely removed. In Malchus, it's at least a melech ala am, it's nasus ala am. He's already extending himself to the people, to the point that he actually will give commands and orders that will create the details of existence. So I hope I summed it up in a way that makes sense. With that, I will go back to where we are on top of 12:18, unless somebody wants to ask something, which is fine. Clear? Okay. So on top of page 12:18,
Rabbi Jacobson, the in Malchus, it seems like the revelation of Allah Am, doesn't that occur in Chachma? It's still concealed in Malchus, isn't it? And the first revelation in relationship to the Am would be, I would think, from Ayin from Ani to Ayin, that occurs from Ayin to Ani in Chachma, rather than Chachma of Bria, rather than in Malchus Malchus Ba'Atzilus. It seems like it's still concealed. And that was my first question. The second one was, at the end, you just mentioned that the three relationships are the Melech, the Am, the father to the child, the son, and then the husband to wife. Are those three separate tracks, or are those tracks of the father and the husband? Are those separate tracks from Melech that the Rebbe will explain later in 9 Beis, or is all that's included in this whole entire discussion?
Okay, so first, regarding your first question, so let me explain a little more detail. Chachma is not Malchus. Chachma is the wisdom. Once God or the Melech has a reveal, the Snasus Atzmi is revealed in him. So we learned on page we look on page, the bottom of page 1215. Or 1215 on the bottom. So once you have a desire for something, so first there's the level of Isnasus Atzmi that's revealed, as he said. Then comes into a Ratzon L'Meluchi, as a Ratzon. So Chachma's role is design. What kind of nation is this going to be? Because the Ratzon is just a will. The Isnasus Atzmi is just a transcendent state. Chachma is like the artist that begins to draw. Okay, what type of kingship do you want? What kind of kingdom do you want? Or what kind of home do you want? So Chachma's role is the Nakuda that begins shaping it. Bina, as he explained, is Mitzayer, is like shapes it into shape and form. Chachma is just the Nakuda. So Chachma is beginning to design the home or the kingdom that the Melech wants. That will go through all the levels. The Midas will give it even more shape and form, because it's all about the different aspects of creation now include Chachma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvur. I'm not called Das right now. Let's not count Das. Chesed, Gvur, Teferes, Netzach, Chod, Yesod, which is all part of what this kingdom is going to look like. And Malchus is where it becomes implemented, and the birthing of the next world. So if you had everything till Malchus, you wouldn't have a creation. it'd all be on blueprint, it'd be on paper or in concept, not in actualization. It's Malchus that ultimately realizes or fulfills what Kesser first wanted, using all the faculties that are channeled through Malchus. So Malchus is where you say, call him a melech. You don't call Chachma Malchus. It's Chachma Sheba Malchus, as Kesser Sheba Malchus, which is like that whole process. So you begin with Ratzon, the faculties shape things, and then Malchus creates. And Malchus, again, is in a form of concealment and distance, as a melech is. The king, as a wise person, is more or less concealed from us. We really see his melchus. We don't see his wisdom. And the wisdom, however, has helped shape whatever it is that exists now. That's the answer to the first question. Going to the second question, just following from that, I just used father and son and husband and wife to just contrast what he's saying here. Melech and Am is the main focus here, because here we're talking about the distance, the concealment, that there needs to be a leap from a Melech to an Am. They're not equals. Ultimately, Em Kabonim, Em Kavodim, ultimately, through Avodah, our relationship with God is going to be a multi-dimensional one. Like we say, we have our relationship as a Melech. That's more Kabbalah All Malchus Shamayim. Like if you want Yiras HaMelech, Yira. Ava, on the other hand, is more closeness. Could be seen more like a brother or a partner or husband and wife or a child and a father. So the point I just wanted to make was that ultimately we need all these levels of relationship, because we need to both be permeated and close to God, but also know that God is God and we're not God, which is why we always see him as a king. So it all comes down to which level of Aveda. I don't want to go into that now, really, because not what he's discussing. I just wanted to put it in context of what he is discussing. Right now, the main discussion is the distance, the Melech and Am relationship, the king and the nation, which means a divine dimension that's beyond, completely beyond, has now gotten closer in the sense, desires, shapes through the spheres. Malchus, however, is still beyond, but it's a beyond that connects. He's a melech on the Am. So on Rosh Hashanah, when we coronate God, we're bringing his snasis atzmi of a God beyond, at least being a melech over us. So it's still Malchus, it's still transcendent and exalted, but it's now over us. So it's makif, but it's a makif that relates to us. And ultimately, our goal is obviously to reach the highest levels. That's it.
So would that be Malchus as it descends into Bia? Malchus as it descends in Malchus, Shabbat Malchus, and Atzilus, there's still no Am there, right? It's only as when it. But
Malchus, Shabbat Malchus,
yeah.
But Malchus Shabbat Malchus is ready to be a king over the nation. Now you need a parsa, you need a concealment, but now Malchus will become Kesser of Bria. So Malchus of Atzilus will become the king, the crown of Bria.
Right, but only after it descends into Bria, no? Only after it descends in, okay.
Yeah, but it can't descend into Bria if it isn't first a Malchus of Malchus.
Right, but in Malchus of Shabbat Malchus, in Atzilus, there's still in its pure state.
Well, it's in its lowest state. It's in the lowest state of Atzilus.
Right.
But now it will, once it descends, it's like, it's like the king is now ready to actually become king of the nation.
Right. Like he's in his palace, in his room, ready to come out and be revealed to the Am, but that only happens as it is really in Bria, as I would understand it, maybe not, but that seems
That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that.
Okay.
Fine. That's correct. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you.
In the levels that we're discussing here is that God is beyond being a creator. He chooses to become a creator. That creator has to then turn into a plan and design, and then he's ready to actually create. So Bereshis bara Elokim follows Keser, then it goes into levels and levels till he actually begins to create. So it's like any process. We talk about the artist. First, the artist envisions. First, he wants to be an artist. Then he envisions what kind of art, infinite types of art. Then he envisions one type of art, and then he actually is ready to start painting and drawing a piece of art. That's when he actually becomes a creator. Malchus of Malchus is when he actually becomes a creator. And that Malchus of Malchus will have the Asara Maimoris Nivra Elam, and that will then descend into Biyah, into an actual creator. Yemer Elikim Yehi Oyer Vayhi Oyer. That's Malchus speaking. That Malchus is saying Yehi Oyer, and that Yehi Oyer will then become actual Oyer in Bria, and then Yitzira see it. Yeah.
So when we say that Moshe Rabbeinu was Chachma de Atzilus, it seems like that would precede the creation and Malchus of Atzilus. How could somebody have a relationship with God, even an exalted state like Moshe Rabbeinu or Chesed Sheba Atzilus, Avram Avinu, if they haven't? That precedes Malchus of Atzilus. So are they relating to God before he's king, so to speak, in Malchus of Malchus?
No, because there's Malchus of Ak. There's Malchus higher than Atzilus. There's Malchus of Ein Sof. There's Malchus on highest levels. Before anything exists, there's Malchus. We're going to learn that now.
Okay, thank you.
Malchus doesn't start in Atzilus. Malchus starts higher than that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We're talking about Malchus of creation is Malchus of Atzilus. Okay, so then on top of page 1218, that's what we learned last class. I'll just go over it quickly. Al derech zeh be'esu spheres the Atzilus, the Malchus the Ak. The same things with the 10 spheres of the emanations of Malchus of Ak. Nasa keser va'atik la'Atzilus. That becomes a keser and atik of Atzilus. And now he's going to go to the highest levels, all the way to before the Tzimtzum. So he says, V'cheinu, top of page 1218, the second line. V'cheinu b'chlolus ishtalsus, the parts of the Ak. And the same is in the general evolution, or the evolution of the structure of Ak, shenetzal ma'atzmus Ein Sof, that emanated from the core of Ein Sof, the Malchus, the Ein Sof, nasa keser la'Ak. So we have now keser of Ak, Malchus of Ak becomes the keser and atik of Atzilus, just like Malchus of Atzilus becomes the keser and atik of Bria, and further down all the way to Asiya. Malchus of Yitzira is Malchus of Bria is Keser of Yitzira, Malchus of Yitzira is Keser of Asiya. So the same thing is higher up. The Malchus of Ak becomes Keser of Atzilus, and Malchus of Ein Sof, which is the last level before the Tzimtzum, becomes the Keser of Ak. And here's where we stopped, and here I'm going to explain this now further. But let me just say a small introduction before we continue. The challenge really, as I mentioned last class, is to understand what's the difference between Malchus of Ein Sof and Keser of Ak, then Malchus of Ak and Keser of Atzilus. I mean, for us, it's just words. They're all equally ethereal and abstract. So true explanation would have to require understanding them in different dimensions. And this is why I always say that the only way to really appreciate is through avodah, your own avodah. So let me say a few words about that, because it'll make things a little more practical than instead of mechanical. Because the last thing I want to do is just memorize words here, and just like a formula, Malchus here, Keser there. There's really much more going on here. So to use the language of Ayin Beis earlier, we all begin in our lives first knowing about ourselves and then discovering God. You wake up in the morning, the first thing you feel is your body. You're hungry, you're thirsty, you're tired, you're not tired. Your bodily needs, because we're physical creatures where the divine has been concealed from us. So the first step in any avodah is acknowledging there's a reality more than you. Life does not orbit around you and your needs. So as soon as you say Moida Ani Lifanecha, Melech Chai V'Kayim Shachzata B'Nishmasi V'Chem L'Rabba Munasecha, the first thing, as soon as you're consciously awake, you have changed the natural inclinations of just taking care of yourself. You're saying, Moidani, I acknowledge. Hayda. It's just an acknowledgement. It doesn't mean you understand it. or it's internalized, I acknowledge Melech Chai V'Kayom, Melech Shechzarta B'Nishmasi, the living and sustained King, that you've returned within me, my soul, with compassion. So what have you done? Here, a self-contained ego, driven by self-interest, which would be the natural human condition, natural, I mean in this physical world, has now acknowledged that there's something more than you are. There's a melech. That melech is giving you, returned your soul to you. Now, if you continue that train of thought and that process, you then say the other brachas. Neshama shenasata b'tahirihi, ata barasa, ata yitzarta, ata nefachta bi. Literally the worlds we just described here. What are you saying? That this soul within me has dimensions. It didn't just come into me, it went through a whole journey of stages. So really what you're doing is, by first acknowledging there is a soul that God gave you, the Melech gave you, you then grow in your understanding, appreciation of that divine soul. And you go through stages. That first, the soul relates to you. Then you come to understand a little more godliness, and a little more and more. When you come to Atzilus, essentially Malchus, the Melech, Chai V'Kayim of Atzilus, as opposed to the Melech of Yasiyah, would be that the primary thing is God, and you're secondary. When you're in Asiyah, the primary thing is you, and you're recognizing you have a neshama. So each of us has to identify where we stand. And we have to go through these stages all the time. Because we all know, as much as you have bittul to godliness, you could always have more bittul to our own needs. This happens all the time. You know, you're involved in something, let's say you're learning Torah, you're learning Ayin Beis, you're learning Chassidus, you're very inspired. Then you go back to life, to your regular life, and something aggravates you, or something is needed, or some expectation, or some physical temptation, or interest. So you need to remind yourself all the time, because the helam of the Tzimtzum and the helam of Malchus continuously is effective. It doesn't go away so quickly just because you were inspired. What my point is, I'm trying to say is that when you really want to translate this into a way of really understanding it, not just appreciating it and avoid it. You must have avoid it. You must understand it in your context, or else it's just words. What's the difference between Malchus of Atzilus and Malchus of Bria, Malchus of Atzira, Malchus of Asiyah, and Malchus of Akka, Malchus of Ein Sof? We literally went through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Malchus here. Ein Sof, Ak, Atzilus, Bria, Atzira, Asiyah. So you have to define these 6 different ways how you experience Malchus, how you experience God's Malchus Dikait. It could be in a very childish way, like we teach children, Moidani. And I don't mean childish as in a bad way. I just mean it's a beginner level, where you're just recognizing something. Or you can start appreciating, 1 second, God is more than just my creator. He created all of existence. God isn't just an artist. He's beyond being an artist. And you climb the ladder from Malchus through the spheres, Midas, Chachma, all the way to the Keser, which leads you to the next door, where you go through Yetzirah, and through Yetzirah you get to Bria, and through Bria to Atzilus. But it's a climbing a ladder, and it's only going to really be appreciated when you understand each step of the way. So Moida Ani is just an acknowledgement. It's not learning a whole Maimar Chassidus. But let's say after davening you decide to sit down and learn deeper levels. What are you going to discover? That the Eibishter is not just a Melech, he's also a Baal Midas. He also has Chesed, and Gvura, and Teferes, and Netzach, and Hoyd, and Yesod. And then you're going to learn that he has Chachma and Bina, which means manifestations, godly, divine attributes and faculties. And then you come to discover that all that doesn't compare to God being removed. He's transcends his faculties. And then you climb, you get to the next level of the faculties, where they're even more sublime, and more sublime, and more sublime. All the way to before the Tzimtzum, where there it's completely divine consciousness and God just envisioning existence. Whereas the lower levels is already some form of activity and action and building. So if you're talking Asiya, you're talking about the full picture of existence as we know it. If you go all the way up to Lifnei Tzimtzum, you're talking how God envisions it. It's all about God. Now, are we ready to go Lifnei Tzimtzum? Not exactly, because Tzimtzum is very much part of our reality. But Chassidus still, as a gift to us, gives us a picture, a little of what's going on there, so we have something to work toward. But don't ever think, just because you can speak about Lifnei Tzimtzum, it's exactly the same as speaking about Moed Ani, that the Melech is giving you a neshama. There you're talking about things completely on a God level. Now, it would require a lot more time and effort. If we did this properly, each one of us would sit one-on-one, and develop an avodah plan of how to turn this into your avodah that works for you. And not everybody's on the same level. Some of us can much easier climb to Bria or Yetzirah and Bria, and some of us cannot. We're not ready yet. It's like the student and the teacher. You first begin with what you know, the Aleph Beis, and then you grow and expand your consciousness until you can really start relating to things on a deeper and higher level. That's the journey. And that's why Chassidim, who davened 5-6 hours under a talus, they weren't just sitting around. They were on this journey. They were traveling to these places, each according to their level. So I just wanted to state that because this is like the Rebbe Rashab doesn't even say it because it's a given when you learn Chassidus. This is just a given. You have to always know this. Everything being said is all about what I just described, the journey we each have to take. Now here he's explaining it in terms of more how God is creating these steps. But the goal is for us to appreciate these steps and internalize them. That's why I gave this introduction. So now he's moving from Malchus, as I said, Malchus of Ak. He moved out to Malchus of Ein Sof, which we're talking now is the levels right before the Tzimtzum. This is the Ein Sof that really does not have shape and form at all, but relatively speaking, we can talk about it. Or as the Rebbe writes in a famous letter, which I've learned with you a while back, that the levels before the Tzimtzum are really shapeless, but relative to even higher levels, you can call them levels. Or the levels are here all about God, just simply the God wanting this, wanting that. He wants structure, he wants chachma, he wants bina. It's not actually about chachma and bina, it's completely about the God that wants each one of these levels and envisions them, as opposed to Atzilus, where they already have shape and form, Eris and Kalim. So there's no Eris and Kalim Lifnei Tzimtzum, it's all within the divine consciousness. The best thing we can imagine it is our thought process. When you imagine the house you want built, but there's no building yet, but you're imagining it. So it's your imagination, it's your vision. So that's the closest thing to help understand a bit what Malchus of Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, as opposed to Malchus of Atzilus or any of the other levels. It's simply God envisioning, imagining the existence that will come later. Now, of course, all this is above time, so it's all conceptual. It's all on those deepest levels. Like, you may live it, let's say, built your dream home, you're living in it, but if someone asked you, what is it really inside your deepest levels of your soul? What are you experiencing in this home that you live in? You'll say, I don't really have words. There's just a very deep pleasure and a very deep contentment and fulfillment that I know this is the home that I belong in. So you don't have words, but it's definitely a very soulful experience. It's just like when someone says to you, tell me what you feel like when you hear a piece of music. So someone else could hear the music and say it's beautiful, but what do you really feel in the deepest part of your soul? It's hard to articulate, but it's still a very deep experience. So you can have the very reality of existence as we know it, but here before the Tzimtzum, it's how God is experiencing it, so to speak, if you can call it experiencing it. But it's again, words for us, for God wants us to know what's going on in his inner workings, in his inner so-called sanctum, how he's processing it all. Again, all these words are limited words because God doesn't process and so on, but some way to understand how God relates to existence as opposed to how we relate to it. We relate to it in a very tangible, concrete way. This is it. God relates to it from the top down, a very different way, like from a Das Elyon perspective. So that's what we're going to address now, Malchus of Ein Sof, And this, as I said, brings us back to the page 1214. So if you go back to page 1214, before I read on here in 1218, he said like this, after explaining about Ani Rishon v'Ani Achrin with Malchus and Keser. So if you may remember, at the bottom of page 1213, I should go back even earlier. We started speaking about Ani Rishon and Achrin. He spoke about Rishon and Reishis, Keser and Chachma. And then he said, so Chachma gives shape to the desire of Keser. And then he says, Pnimi, and then he says like this. What's that? So the bottom of page 1213, he said this Keser Klali is desire for all the worlds that arose in his desire to create. And Keser Prati is the Keser of each specific world. The Ratzon of Atzilus, the Ratzon of Bria, in each world. That's what he said at the bottom of page 1213. I'm just going back there because he's really saying the same thing here, but now with all the explanation of the last 5 pages. Okay, so then he said, and Ani Achrin, he said, was Malchus that creates Yesh Ma'ayin B'Poel. But the next paragraph, he started like this: Malchus Chuscha Malchus Kol Elamim. The source of all creation comes, and there's something from Malchus, Malchuscha. And he started Malchus the Ein Sof, Atzmai.
Where are you holding, Rabbi? Rabbi, where are you holding?
We're holding on page 1218, but I'm reading
right.
I'm just referring to page 1214.
I understand, but where on 1214 are you reading?
The new paragraph.
Ayin who?
Yeah. So he said, Malchus the Ein Sof Atzmai is Malchus Chamamish, Malchus of Atzmus Ein Sof. So you see, he's talking about Malchus of Ein Sof. Achle Nivra Ha'elam Ha'yehu Shmei Belvad Shmei, which is the name of God as it is before creation. Then he says in the parentheses, Reprotis Yesh B'Zeh Madreges. There's levels, but in general, it's Malchus of Ein Sof. Now he's going to talk more about the details. V'hu Moked the Malchus the Kol Elamim Shebishtalshus Dabiyah. And that Malchus of Ein Sof is the first source for all the Malchus that will go through all of Hishtalshalus of Atzilus Bri Yitzir Kemalchus Da'ak Umalchus Da'atik Yemen V'Arichampin V'Zo Ad Malchus Da'atzilus Umalchus Debria Ad Malchus Da'asiyah Shumadreges HaYeser Tachtena Lahavis Elam HaShafal Shalanu. So he already stated what we're learning now, that it all begins with Malchus of Ein Sof. That in turn will create a Malchus in each world, according to that world. So it's the Keser of each world is the Ratzon of the world, the desire, and the Malchus of each world is the actual creative process. You can't have creation without desire, but without creative process, you don't have creation. You only have a desire. To have a desire for a home, or to have a desire for being a king, or for that matter, to have a desire to have a child is not the same as having a child or a home or a kingdom. So Malchus is the implementer, Ani Achrin, of where it began with Ani Rishon. And Chochma, as we learn now, goes hand in hand with Rishon, Ani Rishon, because it gives the first design and shape, the first Nekuda, the first point of manifesting that desire. And it will conclude, and Malchus will be fully blown. But that's why you say Chachmas, let me not go there. Let me just stop right there. And that's Melech Malchem Lochem Shalamaylo, Tabia, Shakol Nimsha Mekinas Malchuscha, V'hainu Masha'ola B'machshava Atzmius, that which arose in God's core thought. Remember I said envisioning in his thought, Ano Emlech. I want to rule. I will rule. Shazab Chinas Malchus the Ein Sof. And then the Rebbe Rashab went on, Bir Ayin, he starts explaining how Malchus is unique. Why is Malchus unique? So he explained because Malchus is not like the rest of the Midas, which are all revelatory and also have a relationship. Malchus has that paradox. On one hand, there's a relationship, but it's from a distance and therefore in a concealed state. Havdalah, hisnasus, removed. And that's what led us through everything we just learned. And now he's going back and tying it together. So he says now like this. The Malchus, I'm reading now the fourth line on page 1218. The Malchus, the Ein Sof, klula gam kem eses spheres, min ha-keser the Malchus. Malchus of Ein Sof, just like Malchus of Atzilus, we said had all the 10 spheres, from Keser to Malchus. Malchus of Ein Sof also encompasses, the Malchus of Ein Sof klula is also encompassed of the 10 spheres from Keser to Malchus. So now he's going to explain. The Malchus the Ein Sof hu masha'ola b'machshavta yapshuta ano emlech. Like the line we just learned on 12:14. The general role and general function of Malchus of Ein Sof is what arose in God's thought, in God's shapeless thought. Pshuta ano emlech. I shall rule. The machshava zuhi siba klolis al klolis eishtalshus. This thought is the general cause for the overall cosmic order. Should you not have had that, nothing else would emerge, because there has to be a will to have a relationship. In this case, a relationship of distance in the sense of an exalted and transcendent relationship, but still a relationship. You don't have God wanting to be king, you don't have existence. Now, I think it's again important to point out here. King means here transcendent state, that God is transcendent, because God is never going to be one of us. But that doesn't mean we can't have a relationship with him. The question is how deep that relationship is. So right now we're talking about Emlech, but also, as I said, there's also a relationship with God's Chachma and Bina and Das and so on. And Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes. But right now we're talking about the first cause of it all is Ano Emlech. I mentioned in a previous class, which I still have to look, I don't remember explicitly whether this is one and the same as when we say in the Sava Kodesh Baruch Hu Liyas Leis Baruch Dira B'Tachtenim. Because you can make an argument, it's really the same thing, of course, on a lower level. That God had a desire to have a home in the lowest of worlds, which you can say is really later looks like Malchus and Am. Am is the Tachtenim, Dira B'Tachtenim is the king wanting to live among the subjects. In other words, Tachtenim is a Zarim and Nefrodim, because that's what Tachtenim means, as he explains in Tanya. They're not Elyon. Elyonim is a divine revelation. Tachtenim is a state where the divine is concealed to the point Tachten Shein Tachten Lamatim Menu. So you could say that very easily. Say that's like a nation, a people that are not. They're not part and parcel of godliness, meaning they're created by God, but they don't carry a revealed divine element in them. And dafka there, God wants to be king. Dira b'tachtenim. So Nisava we know is an atzmus. Malchus, you can't refer Malchus into atzmus, but you can say that when the process began lifnei Tzimtzum, in that divine supraconscious state, where first emerged, a field of energy, divine energy. In that air started a process. First, that precedes desire. Then it becomes something that gets revealed in some form of desiring existence. And that desire turns into details, envisioning existence. At the end of that process is Malchus of Ein Sof, originates because Nisava Kadosh Baruch Hu. That's the way I would explain it. I have not seen, and maybe I have to look a little more, that is directly correlated in that term, the way I just explained it. But this is the way I've always understood it, and I think is the right way of saying it. If it's said in a mimer, it would be even more beautiful, then it could be really confirmed. But just to put it into context, that's what it sounds like to me, very similar. But Malchus focuses on primarily this relationship that is like where there's a melech and a am. Now, in that itself, there's like isnasus atzmi and there's isnasus ala am, as we discussed. So right now you're saying...
Sound right. But you said sound right. But I think that from this Ave until Malchus the Ein Sof, I don't know the exact process. It's not Il of Olol, of course, even a Malchus the Ein Sof. But it sounds right that everything starts by Nisave.
Yeah, that's for sure. Everything starts with Nisave. I just was associating Malchus to Tachtenim. That Malchus and the Am is similar to Elokus and Tachtenim. Okay. So he says like this. So this is the Sibba Klolis al Klolis Ishtalshus. Now I should probably repeat this that I've said many times. God does not need any of these levels. He doesn't need to think about it. He doesn't need to deliberate. He doesn't need to envision. God says, I want existence, you have existence. But he wanted for whatever, well, not reason, beyond reason, he wanted existence to be one that is like this one, that has intelligence in it, and wanted us to understand as much as possible with our own minds, God's mind, so to speak. So he created a mind, and he created a machshava, and he created a process called Ano Emlech, which is Malchus of Ein Sof. So this is all God's way of creating steps that we can relate to it to some extent. So number one, we understand the process, and number two, we can connect to the process. Something I've said many, many times. It's something that says in some Maimorim, but it has to always be spelled out, because if you don't have that, the big question always comes back to what God needs all these machshav. What is John about before the tzimtzum? Why is there any levels altogether? But that's the answer to it. So Siba Klolos or Klolos Sof. Kimemidus ha'atzmis, the Ein Sof. Okay. Now remember when he spoke about Natzilus, he said from the Midas you can't have creation because the Midas are too close and they're too revealed. So you can't have a separate entity being created out of it. To have a separate entity, you need something that's a little removed. So he says, Kimemidus ha'atzmis, the same thing is Lifnei Tzimtzum. In Malchus of Ein. Kimemidus ha'atzmis the Ein Sof. Because from the core so-called attributes of Ein Sof, is all kavyochel speaking, because there's no actual attributes. We're talking about the source of the attributes, kechesed the Ein Sof. Like we talk about chesed of Ein Sof. This is very rare, by the way. In Maimorim, you don't find often the language chesed of Ein Sof. Usually it's chesed of Atzilus. But he's talking about chesed of Ein Sof, which is really Atzilus the Klolos, the macrocosm. Shalugdulose ha'atzmis ein cheker. He has atzmis. Tis gedulose, his greatness, his chesed. Gedula is another word for chesed. Ein cheker, which means there's no possibility to probe or understand. It's beyond our ability to comprehend or grasp. From God's core kindness, which is beyond anything we could imagine, it would not be possible for it to become the source and reish and the head and the beginning of natzalim, of emanations. Because it's all in the form of Ein Sof. It's taka chesed, so it's a particular type of transmission, but it's chesed of Ein Sof. It's like if someone was pouring love to you endlessly, without filters, without regulators, without breaks, it would completely overwhelm. It doesn't allow for another person to exist. It's like what the Gemara says, Reiv Teva Eni Chel Mekabel, when Chene Hamagel, when they were praying for rain. It was a famine in Israel. They started praying for rain. So finally God said, okay, here's rain. It started coming down, torrential flood that completely flooded and destroyed the fields. That's what a flood does. So they prayed again. He prayed again. Reiv Teva Eni Chel Mekabel. We can't accept so much goodness. It has to come down in raindrops. Raindrops is still rain, but it's drop by drop. It's absorbed in the ground before the whole ground gets saturated. Like a teacher. Imagine a teacher starts teaching and doesn't stop. There's no pause. He's just on and on. Or love. You can suffocate someone with love. So what he's saying is, if chesed, if it was coming from the midas atzmius, he calls it atzmius, core chesed, meaning that unfiltered chesed of God. Everything's Ein Sof. Where's there room for anything? Now, I know we could say, what about the Tzimtzum? But even with the Tzimtzum stops the flow altogether. But here you want to have also a level of godliness that will be able to be subject to Tzimtzum. Chesed is just a flow. You don't have Gvura yet. So therefore, the Chesed is completely overwhelming in that sense. Rak mebchinas Malchus the Ein Sof. Only from the lowest level, so to speak, of Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. Only from that you can have a mocker. Now you have, it's still going to need a Tzimtzum, that actual concealment. But now you've slowed down. Malchus of Ein Sof is already God as being a melech, not as a chesed. Chesed is just a pure flow, an undiluted and unfiltered flow. Malchus, as we learned, is concealing the God's personality. It's just that he's a melech. And as such, that can become a mocker l'isavas elemus. That can be a source for the creation of existence. So now, what have we established? That just like it is a Malchus of Atzilus, only Malchus can create. The same thing, Malchus of Ein Sof, it's Malchus that becomes the force that will relate and create existence. Whereas the higher spheres are not. But now he's going to explain that in Malchus of Ein Sof itself includes all 10 spheres. The he klulam esa spheres. Now this Malchus of Ein Sof has within it encompassed from the 10 spheres. And he's going to explain that right now. But before I continue, if anyone has any questions, this is very high levels. And as I said, I'm trying to explain to the best of my ability, but maybe it needs more clarity or questions or anything like that. Go ahead, if anybody wants to ask it.
I have a question. When we talk about this unlimited flow of each of these midos, are we essentially talking about if an archetype? In other words, what is the nature of chesed or gedula? We can't. In other words, it's to give us some understanding of the core concept of the midah, or how else can we understand it if it's unlimited?
We can't really understand it, and this requires a lot of work of understanding lifnei tzimtzum. The best way I described it before was us envisioning something that has nothing to do with the thing itself. It's like you have a dream about a dream house or dream mansion you want to build. What does it look like in your mind? It's all about you. There's no building, there's no structure, there's no plan even. All it is God envisioning existence. So in the visioning, it's not archetype. Archetypes is already worlds after the Tzimtzum. There are no archetypes here. It's all God envisioning things, his ability to envision. So Chesed of Ein Sof is essentially God's envisioning of Chesed. That is basically an endless flow of love. So that's not going to allow for any existence. He needs to envision Malchus for there to be a relationship that should be something that you cannot leave room for. So this in the beginning of Ayin Beis, for pages upon pages, long discussion between the relationship between the 10 hidden spheres and the 10 revealed spheres. So that's where I explained at length. It's all online, by the way. It's on YouTube and on our channel. Where I explained at length the relationship between the 10 hidden spheres before the Tzimtzum and the 10 spheres after the Tzimtzum. So there he explains somewhat how it's not existing entities, and yet it's God envisioning these existing entities. So it's difficult enough to understand the world of archetypes in Atzilus or Bria. This is already going far beyond that. The Rebbe, in the letter that I learned, I think we learned it together inside at some point, if I recall, maybe not. The Rebbe says that he gives an example in Avodah that when you do a mitzvah, when you do mitzvahs, so you could focus on each mitzvah has its own particular rules. But then if you're doing it with only one thing in mind, fulfilling what God wants, so then it makes no difference the smallest detail of a rabbinic law with the largest mitzvah in the Torah, the biggest mitzvah of all, because from the point of view of God's will, there's no difference between that. The Rebbe uses that as an example for understanding lifnei tzimtzum somewhat. There, the focus is only God, nothing else. So But since God wants chesed, so it's chesed. But it's all about God, 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 God. Malchus is the way God manifests, or at least envisions, the idea of another. Chesed is not envisioning another. And Malchus envisions another. That's why it's Malchus. That's why ultimately it will be a concealed state and not a revealed state. It's only one thing, another, and God is king over that other. God is the creator and we are the creation. Chesed, the focus is on infinite flow. So the same idea is applied, like we said before about Chesed of Atzilus, same thing here, that does not have the ability to create. Now, of course, God can do whatever he wants. Again, he can use Chesed, and if he wants, he can make a Chesed that's a limited flow. You can always ask that question, why doesn't he do that? But then it would not make sense, because Chesed on God's level is it's an infinite Chesed. You'd need an entity like a Malchus. That's where it works. So basically, God is creating these entities in order for us to be able to have some understanding of how something can be created and still have the creator separate from the creation. So chesed, as we said, chesed can also be to people that are close to you. Malchus is the only entity that's specifically and explicitly to another, that's not an extension of yourself. Chesed's role is more of a relationship with things that are an extension of yourself that relate to you. Whereas Malchus is a entity that is an attribute that has a relationship with something that's unlike you. So in the Pre-Tzimtzum, that's what Malchus's role is. The idea of that type of kingship, king over subject.
So
interface.
Okay.
Just a quick follow-up. So this conception of these mitos, starting with you picked Chesed here, is bilti mugbal, just like the Ein Sof itself, but somehow, so it has this paradox of having some kind of independent, some sort of distinction from Ein Sof itself, or it's part of Ein Sof, but yet it's bilti mugbal. So there's a paradox there, and we necessarily can't understand that.
No, I wouldn't say there's a paradox at all. God is Ein Sof, and Ein Sof can take on 100,000 shapes, million shapes. Here it happens to be Chesed. There's no Chesed. It's just God is Ein Sof, is going to manifest in something that will ultimately, after the Tzimtzum, become a defined entity. At this point, there's no defined entity. It's just a word we're using. So it's like God, it can go in infinite different directions, and he's choosing certain directions. It's like, as I said, imagination. You can imagine a million things right now. It's all Ein Sof if you're an Ein Sof entity. And if you imagine one thing, it's just an extension of that Ein Sof. It's just taken on a certain, because God has the ability to obviously envision a specific flow, like Chesed, just like he can envision Gvura or Teferis.
Okay.
But this is
thank you.
already a reader from the Ein Sof. The Chesed of Ein Sof is already a reader. It's not really God is himself, the Atzmus. Even Chesed the Ein Sof.
Well, you read it compared to Atzmus or compared to Ein Sof that doesn't have
Compared
spheres?
to Atzmus.
Compared to Atzmus, we're not talking about Atzmus here. Atzmus is b'chal off limits, really. If you talk about Ein Sof, like Spheres Ein Ketz, there's a level where the artist has infinite possibilities to create art. And then he chooses that I'm going to create art 10 building blocks called Chochmah through Malchus, okay? We talked about this example many times. So the artist can be in a state where he still has infinite possibilities. That's called Spheres Ein Ketz. Can go in all infinite, in unlimited ways and unlimited. You have even higher than Spheres Ein Ketz, where the artist is not even called an artist. Hold on, let me finish.
Right.
Where the artist is not even called an artist. Even being an artist is already a state. He's supposed to be an artist. And you can go higher, higher, and higher. All Lifnei Tzimtzum, all this is God's infinite capacity to do everything he wants, which means he can go in infinite possibilities. Then in the infinite possibilities, he chooses Chesed or Gvura or these, what we're talking, Chesed of Ein Sof. So essentially, like he says in volume 1 at length, that the finite choice is still a piece of infinity. It's not finite. God simply says, instead of going infinite pieces of art, I want to create one piece of art. He hasn't created it yet. It doesn't have parameters. It doesn't have structure. It's simply the same God that can extend in infinite ways is now choosing and saying, I'm going to extend in chesed, gvura. So basically, it's all God's infinite power. Now, we can't relate to that level because we're not on that level. The only way we can go is through extrapolation and saying, okay, the chesed and gvura of our lives, with their real parameters, chesed is not gvura, is rooted some way before the tzimtzum in God wanting that chesed. So God wanting that chesed or envisioning that chesed is what we're talking about. I would suggest listening to the classes I gave all the way in the early pages of Ayin Beis, where he speaks literally about this. What's the difference between the hidden spheres and the revealed spheres?
Can you point to where in volume one? Where?
For the first chapters, I don't know, chapter 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. All these chapters in the beginning of Ayin Beis. Hold on. They're all titled, and there are even descriptions of those classes. So if you go, for example, to ayinbeis.com, you'll see each chapter has a title. It'll say 10 hidden spheres or whatever it may be.
Just like you do for our shiurim here. I get it.
Yeah. So it's all titled. I would suggest going there because there I elaborate at length. He elaborates at length, and I explain it. What's the difference between the states? I'm just giving a little taste of it now because he's mentioning it here. But this is not easy material because it requires a lot of work of abstracting something to the point where you see it completely from God's point of view. And when you see it that way, everything takes on a different shape. But it takes more work to get to that type of. Now, I'm sure when we talk about Lifnei Tzimtzum, all of us have a different visualization of that level. So yeah, that's why it's important to learn it inside. But he discussed it there at length.
Okay, thank you very much.
I'll just say one thing that he does bring there, and I'll bring one example. What's the difference between the power of vision and the power of hearing in your etzem hanefesh than how it is manifest in your actual faculties? Can you imagine? What does sight look like in the core of the soul before it's taken on particular shape? You have to say that it's originating there, but it doesn't have any shape and form there. So what does it look like? That's how abstract this is going to be. And with Eibishter, it's even more. Lifnei Tzimtzum is even more than etzem hanefesh. So what does sight and sound look like in the core soul? Now, even in the brain, when they do today's the senses, the sensory, the tools that they map a brain, that when you hear a sound, a certain part of the brain begins to function, or they do it through color schemes and so on. Even that is difficult to imagine, because in the brain, the power of vision and the power of sound may stimulate different parts of the brain, but they don't look like sound and sound or sight. It's just different parts of the brain. So right there, how do you explain sight and sound when it's still in the neurons of your mind, as opposed to how it is when we actually see and hear? So
it's a nice analogy. Yeah.
So what you're seeing from this is that you got to learn how to, knowing some quantum mechanics can't hurt, because that also gives good examples for states of probability that are not determined yet. And the most importantly, it's really coming to learn that the deterministic universe that we know is very superficial, that nothing is really deterministic. It just takes on that shape and form. Now, I'm not saying water and fire are one. They're obviously two different entities. But fundamentally, the subatomic particles in fire and water are the same. They're just different combinations. So when you really look at it at the core, before it took on shape of fire and water, what is it like? This is part of how you have to extrapolate these ideas. And just for the record, some of what I just said can only be Asir Ruchnis. We're not even talking about Atzilus, and definitely not Lifnei Tzimtzum. That's why this is complicated, because even visualizing a spiritual entity versus a physical one is already more abstract than the physical parameters and structures that we're familiar with. So it's really, we're talking about a world beyond definitions that's choosing to begin to wanting to define itself, if you want to put it in different terms. So the way I'd say Chesed of Ein Sof is God of beyond definitions choosing to begin to envisioning or wanting to have chesed. So that chesed is not yet meant, it's not meant to be a creator, it's meant to be a flow of infinite energy. Malchus is meant to be a creator, meant to be a melech. And a melech is his personality is conducive to another, which would then lead to the tzimtzum that will create the other. Remember, even Malchus of Atzilus needs a parsa to become Keser of Bria. We learned that explicitly. Top of the page, last page, 1217. So for sure, Malchus of Ein Sof, Malchus of Ein Sof will require the tzimtzum. Okay, let me just see here.
At one point, just real quick, at one point you said or Ein
Okay.
Sof, but we're talking about Ein Sof here, and there's a difference, right? Ein Sof is Atzmus, but or Ein Sof is not Atzmus.
No. None of this is Atzmus.
Oh, okay.
Atzmus is a different discussion ultimately. Atzmus is not not Ein Sof. Atzmus is beyond it all. So when you use Atzmus, the real meaning of Atzmus is not here. Where he wants to talk about Atzmus, he'll make it very clear he's talking about Atzmus. In the end of volume 2, there was some discussion about Atzmus, built to Mitzias Nimtza, we're talking everything is in the levels of Eir and Sof here. Eir and Ein Sof are very, Eir and Ein Sof are similar. And we're talking about Eir and Sof that is beyond spheres, Eir and Sof that's now manifesting in the 10 hidden spheres, or what he called Chesed of Ein Sof.
So when he says Ein Sof here, it's synonymous with or Ein Sof. I thought there was a difference.
Yeah, it's pretty synonymous. Because he wants to focus on the Ein Sof element, not the Eir part. But what it is ultimately within the Eir Ein Sof, Chesed of Ein Sof.
Okay, thank you very, very much.
Okay, the He Klulam Esser spheres. So now this Malchus of Ein Sof is encompassed of the 10 spheres. I think I'm going to stop here because now he's going to speak about the 10 spheres. He's going to start with Keser within Malchus of Ein Sof, which is Ratzon. And we'll go through the levels. This is going to be a little more familiar territory because this has been discussed many times, but it's very high levels now, very highest levels of the early stirrings of existence as it is within God's consciousness, if you want to call it that, infinite consciousness. So I'll stop here, but any other questions?
Yeah, and this what we've just been learning about the Esser obviously it's before Lifnei Tzimtzum. So the Rabbi doesn't use the term Esser Genuzos, but I assume that's what he's referring to, Esser Genuzos. No?
Yeah, there's no other Esser. Yeah.
Right. So he just doesn't use, he doesn't, earlier in volume 1, he used to use Esser Genuzos a lot, but here there's, wasn't it? But that's what he means, obviously. Okay.
Most likely. I mean, I can't imagine what else you can call them because I've never, there is there may be a reason he doesn't call it Esser Genuzos because there is a level of Esser spheres that is higher than Spheres Ein Ketz. So it could be he's referring to that, but I have to look that up and see if that's possible. There is a level of Esser spheres higher than Spheres Ein unlimited spheres. And that's, of course, in a very, very abstract level. So it's possible that's what he's referring to. I don't think so, but for all practical purposes, you can call it, and I did refer to it that way, because to me it was a pretty given, but maybe since he doesn't use it, maybe you have to be careful. Maybe I may be, yeah.
There is such a concept, I never heard that higher than all of this is still called Esser spheres.
Yeah.
Even higher than Esser spheres. There is such a thing.
Yeah.
Obviously, everything that we said about Oyer Ein Sof, it does not mean that the Oyer Ein Sof comes to a point that there is a limit, because the Oyer is Me'ein HaMoyer. Of course, it's only a Oyer. It's just Legabe Atzmos. It's nothing. But the Oyer Me'ein HaMoyer, that means that we could go higher and higher in that, right?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of meanings in Hamoyer. Remember, even Chesed of Atzilus is called Ein Sof Lis Pashtuse. That goes endless, except only within Atzilus, not outside of Atzilus. So the concept of Ein Sof and Ein Sof has many, many levels. You're talking about we talked to Eir HaKol Batz Musei, Kodim Kikad Musei, Kol Batz Musei, Eir Legalis La'atzmei, Eir Legalis L'Zulosei. So Eir has many, many levels. We're talking now about Eir Ein Sof as it's beginning to become defined in God's vision.
Even a kolol be'atzmusai, no? Even a kolol be'atzmusai, or kefi shehu lezulosai, all of this is it's mein amoyer, but it's not.
Well, Chassidus talks about we learned
it's not an entity.
We learned about this at length in volume 2, that even Eiris and Kalim and Atzilus is me'ein hamoyer. Depends what you mean by me'ein hamoyer. Me'ein hamoyer habligvul, me'ein hamoyer ha'eir hagvul. They're all me'ein hamoyer. The question is kamoya etzem or mina etzem. Remember that? Min konof or konof. So it could be coming from the eir, from the reflecting, but it's reflecting a particular aspect, or it's reflecting all of Ein Sof. Chesed of Ein Sof obviously is Chesed of Ein Sof. Son. The truth is, it deserves a lot of explanation. I'm not denying that. I just think if I go now into the whole explanation of what he spoke about in volume 1, as well as volume 2, it's going to be more than a 5-minute conversation. You can talk about a few hours, actually. I'm happy to do it. If everybody wants me to do it, I'll go there. But I probably would recommend best is to listen to some of the classes on the earliest Ayin Beis on this topic, see what you come away with, and then by all means, if you have questions or you want a further clarification, I'll be happy to do it. Here he's obviously definitely relying on that we already learned that, and we know at least to some extent what all that is. But we can continue now. If you remember, I don't know if all of you in this class were when we learned Tzadik Daled. In the end of volume 2, we were learning Tafresh Tzadik Daled. There was a long discussion as well on this, or a long discussion about the little levels before the Tzimtzum and how you understand them. In the way we're discussing right now.
Okay.
In essence, there's unlimited amount of levels.
That's correct.
The more you learn, the more you'll discover.
Absolutely. And the more you climb, as I said, when you go into the Etzem HaNefesh, when you go into deeper levels, actually there's not even opposites there. Like I said, in Etzem HaNefesh, sight and sound reside right near each other. And they can't even say near each other. There's no space like that. It's like anything like that. It's like, this touches, even if I may, things that today scientists and thinkers are constantly trying to understand how from a state of synapses in the brain, you actually get defined, you get defined structures. When you go back, the further back you go, it seems like everything is one big nebulous ball of energy. And then suddenly it becomes defined entities. I mean, I'll take it a step further. I always bring this example. Upon conception, you have one cell that was fertilized, egg fertilized, a seed fertilized an egg, about one cell. The cell, as Rabbi Lezer pointed out, takes 18 hours till it splits. Right. You tell me, how does your whole personality and all your neurosis and all your mishigas and all your good things as well, everything, all exist in that one cell? If you were able to go back in time and get it back to that one cell and put it under an electron microscope, I don't know, whatever, magnify it infinitely, what would you see? And how does that turn into, look at us. Here we are sitting here, with all the stuff we have. I said Nerai, I was making a little fun, your neurosis and all this stuff, but you know what I mean. All our complexities. It's all in that one cell. So the truth is, what we're addressing here is really the very nature of all existence. And not even, here it's talking about obviously God creating it all. But even if you didn't use the word God, you still need much explanation. Like they try to understand the Big Bang. what was the existence like the moment before the Big Bang? So they talk about concentration that was like, beyond, they take 1 second after the Big Bang. They're trying to emulate that. I mean, it's like mind-boggling. And a lot of it is speculation, frankly, but they're trying to understand similar, I don't say it's like lifnei tzimtzum, but they're trying to understand a reality as it is still in a state that's not yet been shaped. It's not so easy. I can't even figure out how a chef makes a delicious meal based on a bunch of ingredients.
Now we're talking.
Right. So how am I going to figure out lifnei tzimtzum?
Rabbi, you before we got into this,
you take a bunch of ingredients, you mix it with hot water, and all kinds of things start happening.
Before you, as you introduced this section of Ayin Beis today in this year, you said in order to better understand these different levels, it takes avoida. We can't just sort of think of it in some kind of textbook-like form where it's just theoretical and we map it out, and that's not doing justice to it. It's a pair of sort of right. So
exactly
right. So can you give me, some of us, an example of how does avoida take us to a better understanding?
I just gave an example. I gave the Rebbe's example, not even mine. That there's you can do a mitzvah where you have in mind your interests, but it's also a mitzvah. You can do a mitzvah where you know the specific details of the mitzvah, and you may even have a preference of one mitzvah over another. Or you can do even a small detail that the rabbi suggested we do, and for you it's equal to the biggest mitzvah of Avos Yisrael because it's all God's will. That's all that matters, that God wants you to do it. And it makes no difference how big of a mitzvah, how small of a mitzvah it is, whether it's a detail, whether it's a large thing, it's all God's will that you're performing. So when you have that equalized state, that's a state like lifnei tzimtzum.
Okay, thank you. And you're suggesting that the better you get at that, then we'll have better access to understanding.
And I'm not even suggesting, I'm saying it with absolute certainty.
Wow.
Yeah, because Chassidus was never meant to be a book of cosmic mechanics, and the spiritual levels. It's not a mathematics, not physics. It has elements of that. It obviously spells out levels. Chassidus, the real Chassidus is understood only when you experience it. If you don't experience it, I didn't say there are people who know all the levels of, say, the shtalshlus, but they know it like a chessboard. It's a game. It's a mind game. It's a bunch of levels, and it's brilliant, all these levels. But if you really want to get it, especially these, there's no way. There's only avodah. I can't see how somebody can experience lifnei tzimtzum with their mind. It's just not possible. We're not God. When God says to Moshe, "No one can see me and live," it wasn't a game. It wasn't like, "Oh, if you see me, you'll get blind and the light is so bright." It just, you won't be you if it's me. We can't. There has to be something. Yeah. So it makes total sense that if you want to experience a godly level, you need to somewhat learn to strip yourself of your preconceived structures. Now, the goal here is not to be annihilated in the process. That happened to Nadav and Avihu and to the three in the orchard where they went and they got hurt. The goal here is that you should come out intact and it should still be you, which is why we talk about the steps, first learning with a teacher. You first learn step 1, step 2, your mind expands. As your kalim expand, you can receive more earth. 40 years, you can begin to appreciate the very core ideas, etc., etc. So the goal is constantly climbing, but also going the pace that works. Once in a while, maybe you can. Like, frankly, if I was doing an avodah, I would never tell anyone to start before the tzimtzum. I would say, get back to me after you go from Asiya Gashmis to Asiya Ruchnis, because that's really where we all begin. But listen, we're learning Ayin Beis. The Rebbe Rashab knew all of this and still wanted to give us the highest levels. I see it as a gift. He wants to show us, horizons that we have not yet even come close to, but he's still showing it to us. So that's beautiful, like a tour guide. It says, you may never climb this mountain all the way, but I'm going to show you the peak of the mountain. So that's how I see it somewhat. But you know what? When you learn it properly that way, it also has an effect. The Rebbe Rashab in Torah Shalom, which is a fascinating, the sichos of the Rebbe Rashab, off the record type of conversations. He's unbelievable stuff there. A lot of what I understand comes from that, from the Rebbe Rashab speaking off the record, so to speak. Meaning he's not formal mimer. So he has a line there. He gives a whole big discussion, a long discussion about yichud, unification from above down, from top down, from bottom up. Very, very, very deep stuff. Very. Like, is there a plate? He's talking about literally, he says, is there a plate or there's no plate? Godliness. Is it godly or is there physical entities? It's very high stuff. At the end, I guess the Rebbe Rashab sensed that it was over the heads of most people, maybe all people. So he said at the end there, he says in Yiddish, he says, why he talks about these things. He says, I'll say it in Yiddish and I'll translate. When you know who you're dealing with, you have a different derech eretz, a different respect. So merely just talking about these levels and understanding how God is beyond, that alone gives you another level of respect for God. God is not he's not your playmate. He wants to have a relationship with us. But if you start talking about those levels, I thought that's a very powerful statement of bittul. When you know who you're dealing with, you have a different respect. So even talking about these levels, even if we're not there, is already an avodah. Because you say, 1 second here, Because if these levels are truly true, what does it say about our petty concerns about life? Think about it.
Very well said. Shkoyach, thank you so much for sharing, almost for bringing here on this. That's really very helpful.
Well, I'll say one more thing since I'm already on a roll, if I may. I remember once when I was in yeshiva, so just a beautiful analogy. And it's actually from my great-grandfather, which I didn't know. Great-great-grand, my father's namesake. So I asked Rabbi Melech Tzvibel. Rabbi Tzvibel was my mashpia in Morristown. So I said to him, why does Chassidus talk about these deep levels when we know we can't reach those levels? So he said to me, when he came to yeshiva in 770 in 1962, or 63, 62, I think. Yeah, 62. 61. He said that he had asked Mashpia Rab Shmuel Levittin similar question. Like, why do we learn all these deep things? So Rab Shmuel responded, there was a chassid named Geshem Ber Pahara who gave an answer to this question with an analogy of a king who was once traveling in a deep forest, and he heard this melody, this most beautiful, mesmerizing song that he never had heard before or after. It completely captivated him. Completely. And when he got back to the palace, and he couldn't discover the source of the song, like where's it coming from? He asked his people to go find in the woods somewhere, who's playing this music? I want to hear it again. Anyway, as much as he tried, they couldn't find the source. So they went on a long search. The king could not he could not rest until he heard that song again. It was so powerful that all other songs he heard were not that. So of course the king had all the resources at his disposal, and he had his musicians and from his whole empire come, and they were playing every type of song ever. Maybe someone will get it. Exotic songs, known songs, unknown, nothing. He said, beautiful, but it's not that song. No matter how much they tried, they could not ever replicate that song. So the king continued his life always with that aching feeling that all the songs I've heard are beautiful, but it doesn't come to that song. So he said the analogy was like this, that when neshama is in heaven and the highest levels, it hears songs. It comes down to earth, all these songs we forget. But then we start seeking in life all kinds of things that will inspire us. Music, other pleasures. In truth is, we're looking for that song, that divine song that I would call Pre-Tzimtzum song. That's not part of the analogy. I'm just adding that. And we know it's there because we heard it once, but we can't quite place it. So we can't constantly look for things. When you learn Chassidus, the deepest parts of Chassidus, it teaches you that all the pleasures that you have are beautiful. but they're not that song. So even though you may not know the song, but still the mere fact that you know it's not all the songs and the pleasures of this world is already frees you somewhat from the gullus, from the tentacles of the material world that holds us so powerfully in its clutches. So that was the analogy, and I thought it's a very powerful way of looking at it. So in other words, it's a sense of a reality that whatever you experience in this world is not quite it. That already is a experience of a higher truth.
That's enough to bring you to tears. I was just tearing. Thank you. Amazing.
Yeah.
It puts things in perspective, even without the perspective.
Exactly.
I hope that is tears of joy.
Yeah, it is like Rabbi
Absolutely.
Akiva feels. Yeah, Rabbi Akiva, when he learned Shir Hashirim, Zolgu ein of the Mois, his eyes were
Dripped with tears.
drip. Yeah, tears. Shel Simcha. Yeah, it's very moving. Rabbi Simon, you are the whole entire Shir, the way that you are describing the OCS, Yesher Koyach.
That was amazing.
You're moving. Yeah.
Well, I like to push the rabbi because we get pearls. We get beautiful music.
Kathy Griffin and
What? Go ahead.
It's very inspiring, Rabbi. It's very, very inspiring, and it takes the mundaneness and the details and the dreck of life. I'm sorry to use that word, and really let it go.
This week's parsha, Baal Pa'er.
Yeah, it helps you let it go. It's really amazing. Very, very therapeutic. Thank you.
Okay, well, use it well. And we continue to look for the song. And the more we learn, the more, my feeling is that the more, even if we don't know, we know that it's not it. The mere fact that we know that makes us closer to really hearing the real song. So
will we hear more of this song in the Gula Shlemus? Will we get more of this?
Then you will get the song.
Yeah, right now
That
it's
will
still
be the aha.
Yeah, now it's still Chaylas Ava. We ache for it, and soon we'll get it. But trust me, once you get that, there'll probably be new songs that we'll want to get. Doesn't stop. We're not going on vacation very quickly.
We know how much the Rebbe wanted to give us the Ayin Beis.
Yeah, this stuff is, especially when you learn it slowly and deliberately, tremendous.
It definitely increases the yearning, the desire for the Gula Shlema, and you have this sense of this longing that burns, and it fuels you. And maybe this is what the quest of life, our journey is about, trying to get there.
Yeah.
Shandy,
Okay.
there is no place to park. I need somebody to come with me.
So let's stop here at the top of